the cosmological argument, part 2. Okay, now we've set the argument up. I've given you the argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now what we're going to do is look at each premise individually and look at the conclusion individually, and we're going to talk about objections and how you counter those objections. So here's where you're going to begin filling out the sheet. Now what you see on the left side of the sheet is either evidence in support of the premise or evidence that supports the premise and counters the objection that's coming from the column on the right. And you'll see the objections. They're always going to be in red when they show up here on the screen. If you have any questions about any of this, you can ask me in class. Rest assured, I will be quizzing you on this. So be ready with the cosmological argument. All right, here we go. So here again, here's premise number 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now this argument, this premise gets very little pushback. Few people will try to negate it because it seems very self-evident. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. And so here's the first thing to fill in. This is the first piece of evidence. This is what we know. Something cannot come from nothing. Something cannot come from nothing. Now think about, what if this wasn't true? What if something could come from nothing? What would that mean for us? That would mean that science is impossible. If things don't require a cause to come into existence, then that's a science stopper right there. But we agree that this is true. Something cannot come from nothing. Now, if you say this, an immediate objection is going to come up. Now I may or may not have changed the sheet that you have, and I've added the word quantum. Some people will object and say, well, quantum physics gives examples of things coming into existence from nothing. Here's what they mean when they say that. Quantum physics is the study of subatomic particles. Protons, electrons, neutrons, positrons, things like that. What they have discovered, now I'm just going to admit my ignorance here with quantum physics. I've never actually studied quantum physics, but here's the argument, or I should say the assertion that people will make. They will say that things like virtual particles, which are positrons and some electrons, in the quantum vacuum will come into existence and then fade back out of existence. That is, they seem to come into existence uncaused out of nothing, and then they dissolve just as quickly as they came into existence. And so for some people, this is evidence that something can come from nothing. But there are some problems with that view. Now, I'm not going to go deeply into quantum physics, but here's what you need to know. That is only one theory in quantum physics. There are lots of theories in quantum physics about what's going on at the subatomic level. And so there's just one. I think it's called the Copenhagen theory. But there are others that directly oppose this view. So just keep that in mind. But here's your first line of defense. If somebody invokes quantum physics, especially if this is online, which is probably where you're going to get it, here's the first thing that I say. At last, someone who can explain quantum physics to me. I ask them to please explain quantum physics. I just admit, I don't really know a whole lot about quantum physics. Could you please teach me? Could you explain it to me? What you'll find is that probably in 99% of cases, the person knows nothing about quantum physics. I mean, really, if you're a quantum physicist, are you actually going to be online arguing with people? Do you actually have the time to be on Twitter or Facebook arguing? I don't think so. So get the person to admit their ignorance. They are simply parroting a meme or a talking point or somebody else's idea. So that's the first place I go, is to establish they are not an expert on quantum physics, and I let them know, hey, I'm not either. But we don't have to stop there. Here's another thing to keep in mind. The quantum vacuum is something, not nothing. Here's what's happening, is that there's a guy named Lawrence Krauss who goes around saying that we have evidence that the universe could have come into existence uncaused out of nothing because it happens in the quantum vacuum, where virtual particles come into existence uncaused out of nothing. Well, what he's doing is changing the definition of nothing, because the quantum vacuum is not nothing. The quantum vacuum is something. The quantum vacuum is an energy field. It's an energy field with fluctuating energy. And when there's a fluctuation in that energy, sometimes subatomic particles like electrons and positrons will come into existence seemingly uncaused, but not out of nothing. And then they fade from existence. So what they're using here in logic is called an equivocation. It's where you use a different definition for the same word. So a person who says that quantum physics gives us an example, they're using an equivocation. They're also using a bad analogy because we're not talking about the same thing. It's an extrapolation that there's no evidence for. All right, so let's keep moving on here. Still, we're with the premise number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. And here's a further piece of evidence. Otherwise, anything and everything could come from nothing, and experience confirms this truth. Like I said at the beginning of this segment, if this premise is not true, we might as well stop doing science, because things can apparently just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. But you know it's not true. Are you worried at all that at any moment a Bengal tiger could pop into existence in your room and tear you to pieces? You're not worried about that at all, because in our experience it doesn't happen. You're not sitting there, if you came into the classroom, whatever day it may be, and you saw that there was a horse in my classroom and it had defecated all over the floor, would your first thought be, wow, that just came into existence uncaused? No, you wouldn't think that. You would want to know what senior doing a senior prank, reviving a practice from of old, what senior brought that horse into the classroom and how did he do it? And I said he because girls aren't stupid enough to do something like that. All right, so that's premise number one, and there's very little pushback with premise number one. Now, premise number two is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Not that it's more difficult to defend this one, but some of the concepts I'm going to share with you are a little bit more difficult to understand. So here's the premise. The universe began to exist. So premise number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise number two, the universe began to exist. Now, there is an objection with this one, and this is a very old objection. It's been around at least since the time of the Greeks and probably longer. And the objection is this: the universe is infinite. In other words, the universe has always existed. It has no beginning and no end. How do we know that that is not true? Well, let's approach it with philosophy first. An actually infinite number of past events cannot exist. An actually infinite number of past events cannot exist. Here's what I mean by that. When we talk about infinity and the physical world, there is nothing infinite in the physical world. Nothing infinite actually exists in the physical world. It's got to be something outside of the physical universe for that to even be a possibility. Let's think about it this way. Well, an actually infinite number of past events cannot exist. Here's why. If you started from the infinite past, you would never arrive at today. How do I know this? Well, think about it like this. What if you were traveling from High Point Christian Academy and you got in your car and you got on the road and you started traveling to a destination that was infinitely far away? If you could live forever, would you ever get to that infinite point? The answer is no. You would never get there. Why? Because it's infinitely far away. And so if you can never arrive at a point in the infinite future, you can never get to the present from an infinite past. See? This is where your mind starts to hurt a little bit. Your brain actually starts to ache. Now, here's the other objection with this. Infinity is actual in mathematics, because in mathematics, we use infinite number sets all the time. And so people will say, well, it's real in math, and math is real. Well, here, it's the way you're looking at it. Mathematics uses the concept as a form of discourse, not an actual infinite. And I guess if you want to get a person to see that this is true, let's say, let's talk about, well, like the number pi. Pi is infinite. It never ends. It keeps going. Ask a person, if you could live forever, could you say all the numbers in the number pi? That is 3.14, and then on it goes. And the answer is no. You would never get to the end of it. All right? So it's just a form of speaking. It's a form of discourse in mathematics, but infinites do not actually exist in the physical universe. Okay, so now that's not actually evidence yet. I'll give you some evidence in just a second. Here are some other ideas to go along with it. It is not possible to actually traverse an infinite. You cannot cross an infinite set, which is really what I was just saying. If I had an infinitely long, let's say that I loaned out my lawnmower, and I loaned it out to an infinite number of people. Or no, I loaned it to one guy, and he loaned it to another guy, and then everybody loaned it out infinitely. Am I ever going to get my lawnmower back? The answer is no, because I can't cross an infinite. I can't traverse an infinite set. It is impossible to do. Now, let's go a step further. An actual infinite would result in absurdities. If in the physical universe things were infinite, they would be absurd, which means irrational. And here's an example. This one is called Hilbert's Hotel. Imagine that you drove to Myrtle Beach, everybody's favorite vacation destination, and all of the hotels were booked up, except Hilbert's Hotel. So you pull up to Hilbert's Hotel, and there's a no vacancy sign. You walk up and talk to the night manager, and the night manager says, yep, that's right, the sign is right, there's no vacancy, but the great thing about Hilbert's Hotel is we have an infinite number of rooms. Yes, they are all filled up now. But now let me ask you this. If you have an infinite number of rooms, can you all move down one? The answer is yes, there's always one more room. Always one more room to go. And so the manager simply calls the people in the rooms and asks them to move down one more room. And then suddenly Hilbert's Hotel that was vacant is now, that had no vacancy is now vacant. It can be both vacant and not vacant at the same time, which is absurd. Here's another way of thinking about it. If infinity existed in this world, in this universe, increasing disparities would vanish. Here's an example. The Earth revolves around the Sun less times per year than Venus. Why? Because Venus is closer and its orbit is a lot smaller. And so per year, Venus goes around the Sun more times than the Earth. But if they had an infinitely long number of years to go around the Sun, which one would have gone around the Sun more times? The answer is neither. because they've both gone around an infinite number of times.